They say the hills of Kentucky are quiet, rolling green ridges, dirt roads that twist and vanish into the woods, shacks half sunk into the earth. To an outsider, it all feels simple, almost peaceful. But hidden beneath those hills are stories that no tourist dares to ask about, names that locals whisper only when the night is deep and the lantern light flickers low. This is one of those stories, a story about a shack left to rot and the man who lived inside it. A father who carried not just his children, but his own blood, over and over again, until the line collapsed in on itself like rotten timber. They called him the most inbred father of the hills. The shack still stands, or what's left of it. You'll find it if you travel far enough down a forgotten path, one so narrow that two people can't walk side by side. The boards sag, eaten by rain and decades of silence, the windows black holes where eyes once stared out. But the land remembers. It remembers the children born with twisted faces, their eyes never quite aligned, their speech broken into a language no one outside the hills could understand. It remembers the smell of sickness that lingered inside that one-room home where 10 bodies slept in the same stale air, and where one man ruled over them all with a strange, unquestioned authority. He wasn't a king, though some whispered he believed he was chosen, preserved by keeping the bloodline pure. To the outside world it was madness, but inside those walls it was law. The father had many names, though his real one is buried deep in courthouse records, never spoken in church or carved into any grave marker. He lived in the margins, away from town squares and schoolhouses, hiding in plain sight where few cared to look, and for years no one did. But the children were proof, children who stumbled barefoot through the hills, their bodies marked by the curse of blood too close, their faces testaments to a history that couldn't be erased. When neighbors saw them, they turned away. When they cried, their echoes vanished into the trees. And when anyone asked about their father, the answer was silence, as if even speaking his name risked bringing the whole horror back to life. This is not folklore. This is not myth. This is the truth of Kentucky's forgotten shack and the man whose sins bled into his own sons and daughters. The father was not born into power, nor was he born into respect. He came from poverty so deep that hunger etched itself into his bones before he could even walk. His own parents were shadows, faces blurred by neglect, whispers carried through the holler that his mother was also his cousin, that his father was not only husband but brother. In those woods, where bloodlines twist tighter than vines, he was not an exception. He was the product of a pattern older than memory. But where others might have broken away, he embraced it, feeding a cycle that would consume everything he touched. As a boy, he learned that silence was survival. Teachers at the one-room schoolhouse said his eyes never met theirs, his speech slurred like a man drunk though he was just a child. By 12, he stopped attending altogether. The hills swallowed him, and from then on, his world shrank to family, only family. By 17, he was already more than just a son. He had taken what was near, what was forbidden, and remade it in his own twisted image of tradition. His first child was born to someone who should have been his sister, his second to someone closer still, and yet the community, small, tight, desperate, looked away. For them, survival meant not questioning what was happening beyond the tree line. The shack became his fortress. One room, one table, one bed too large and sagging with the weight of his empire. Those children came one after another, pale and frail, their eyes crossed, their jaws set wrong, their bones fragile. Some never lived beyond infancy, others grew into shapes the outside world could barely understand, limbs bent, words twisted into sounds no teacher could decipher. Yet, in that shack, they were not seen as broken. They were his legacy, proof that the blood remained his, proof that he controlled not just the present, but the future, and he believed himself untouchable. The law in town knew of him, but who would trek miles into the hills to intervene? Who would risk bringing that sickness of the blood into the public eye? Easier to pretend he did not exist, to let the hills bury his story under leaves and silence. But the hills have long memories, and the children's faces no outsider could mistake, were living testimony to the sins he passed down. For in his eyes, family was not sacred, it was ownership, and in that twisted creed he found a way to play God inside the hollowed-out heart of Kentucky. The shack became more than just wood and nails. It was a cage, and everyone inside was bound to the father's will. He had rules, though they were never written down, and they cut deeper than scripture. No one left without his permission. No one spoke of the family beyond the trees, and when strangers passed through, the children were hidden, pushed into corners, their crooked bodies shrouded in shadows until the danger was gone. His authority was absolute, carved into his children with a voice that could rise like thunder or drop to a whisper more terrifying than rage. Nights were the worst. With a fire that barely held back the cold, the air inside grew thick with the stench of damp clothes, sweat, and fear. The children lay in silence, packed tight on the floor, knowing that at any moment the father might rise from his chair and make his way across the room. What he took, he always took without question, without resistance, and without shame. The daughters knew it before they understood the meaning of it. The sons knew it by watching, powerless, until their turn came to inherit the cycle. To outsiders, this was sin beyond comprehension. To him, it was simply the law of blood. Whispers traveled through the hills like smoke. Neighbors spoke of seeing thin, pale figures darting between trees. Hunters found signs of children in places no family should live, makeshift beds of leaves, gnawed bones of animals caught by desperate hands. Once, a child wandered too far and was caught by a passing farmer. The farmer said the boy's eyes pointed in two directions at once, his teeth jagged like stones, his words a slurry of sounds that carried no meaning. When asked his name, the boy simply repeated the word, "Daddy," again and again, as if it were the only word he truly knew. The farmer returned him to the shack without protest. He knew better than to interfere. The father fed on that silence. He believed the outside world could never touch him. In truth, he was right for many years. The law stayed in town, the church kept its prayers for other souls, and the people of the hills carried on pretending he was just another recluse lost in the woods. But behind those warped walls, a kingdom of decay spread wider with each passing generation. And in that kingdom, the father sat enthroned on rot, believing himself eternal, while his children bore the evidence of his ruin. But eternity has cracks, and even in the hills, secrets do not stay buried forever. The first crack came when sickness spread among the children, not a simple fever, but something deeper carved into their very bones. Legs that bowed until they could not walk, mouths that could not form words, only sounds half human, half cry. Some called it the curse of the shack. Others whispered it was God's punishment, but for the father, it was proof of his dominion. He told his children they were chosen, marked by blood that no outsider could ever dilute. In his mind, the deformities were not shame, they were the seal of purity. One child, a daughter, tried to escape. She was no more than 15 when she vanished into the woods one night, barefoot, carrying nothing but a hunger for freedom. She made it as far as the dirt road where the hills give way to farmland. That was where she was found, cold, starved, barely breathing. The farmer who discovered her drove her back himself, stopping his wagon just shy of the shack. He did not cross the threshold. He left her there, on the ground, where the father's shadow swallowed her whole. By morning, she was never seen again. The hills knew then that the shack was a place of no return. Families kept their distance, and hunters marked the land as cursed, yet the children still appeared now and then at the edge of town, faces pale, eyes wandering, voices broken like echoes in a cave. They begged not for food, but for acknowledgement, to be seen, to be spoken to as if they belonged to the same human world as everyone else. Most turned them away, some tossed scraps, and always, the children returned to the shack before night fell, like moths trapped in a flame they could never escape. The father, though, grew older. His body sagged, his voice cracked, but his hold never loosened. If anything, his control deepened, for the children had no world beyond his, and their misshapen forms left them no hope of finding life elsewhere. They were prisoners, not just of his will, but of their very blood. And so the cycle wound tighter, each child born more fragile than the last, each generation folding inward on itself, collapsing like a structure built on rotten beams. Still the father stood, ragged but unyielding, convinced that his legacy would outlive him, even as the hills themselves seemed to groan under the weight of his curse. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because what comes next is not just the story of a man, but of a bloodline trapped in a prison it could never escape. This is where the line between human and spectre begins to blur. The father's children grew into adults of their own, if you could call them that. Bent bodies, slurred tongues, eyes that wandered apart like mirrors cracked down the center. They had children too, though no one dared ask by whom. The lines tangled until brother was father, sister was mother, cousin was all three at once. To outsiders, it was unthinkable. To the shack, it was simply the way things were. By now, the community could no longer ignore it. Stories spread of children with faces so misshapen they seemed more like masks than flesh. A boy whose jaw never closed, leaving him to drool endlessly into his own lap. A girl whose back bent like a bow, forcing her to crawl rather than walk. And yet, when church bells rang on Sunday, no one went up the hill to intervene. It was easier to leave the horror in the shadows than drag it into the light, easier to whisper about curses and God's wrath than to admit that human hands had built this kingdom of suffering. But there were some who could not look away. A doctor, once, rode out from town after hearing tales of the children. What he found was not just sickness, but a living record of bloodline collapse. He said their bodies told the story without words. The twisted bones, the vacant stares, the garbled speech, all traced back to the same father who sat in his chair like a king of ruin. The doctor left shaken, his notes sealed away, never spoken of in public again. For to share them would be to admit that such darkness thrived not in faraway lands, but in their own hills under their own watch. The father took pride in this silence. He told his children that outsiders feared them because they were chosen, because their blood was stronger than any other. And though their bodies betrayed them, their minds too fragile to understand, they believed him. He fed them not just food, but a mythology of power, and in that twisted gospel, his curse became their inheritance. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent like the hills, or tried to break the chain, even if it killed you? Time is cruel to all men, even those who believe themselves untouchable. The father's body withered as the years dragged on, but his shadow never left that shack. His children, now grown, now warped echoes of his own blood, became his caretakers, bound not by love, but by fear and dependence. Some could barely walk. Others never spoke a clear sentence in their lives, yet all of them orbited him as if he were the only gravity they had ever known. The shack itself mirrored their decay. The roof sagged under the weight of years, the floor buckled, and the air stank of damp rot and unwashed bodies. Rats skittered through the corners, feeding on scraps left to mold. To step inside was to step into a world forgotten by time, a place where progress had never come, where suffering was not an accident but a design. Outsiders who caught glimpses described it as less a home and more a crypt where the living and the dead were indistinguishable. And yet, the father persisted. He spoke of legacy, of keeping the blood strong, even as the proof of its collapse stared back at him from the faces of his children. When one of them died, and many did, he saw it not as failure, but as sacrifice. He would tell the others that their sibling had been called back into the blood, as if death was not an ending, but a ritual. The surviving children would nod, not understanding, their eyes wide, their mouths slack, believing every word as if it were scripture. It is said that in his final years, he rarely left the shack at all. His hair grew long and matted, his teeth blackened, his eyes clouded but still sharp with command. He sat in his chair by the window, watching the hills as though they were his kingdom. The children fed him, cleaned him, obeyed him, waiting for words that came slower each day. But even as his body failed, his control never loosened. His will had seeped too deep into their bones. He did not need strength to rule them anymore. He only needed silence, and the silence had long since become their law. When death finally came, it did not free them. It only left them wandering inside the ruins of his dominion, bound to a ghost who had taught them that escape was never possible. After his death, the shack did not empty. It lingered, alive with the echoes of his rule. The children remained, though now they were adults, their faces worn and strange, their bodies broken by years of sickness and neglect. Without the father's voice, they drifted like shadows inside those rotting walls, repeating the patterns he had carved into them. They lived together, slept together, and carried the curse forward, as if his hand still guided them from beyond the grave. Neighbors began to see them more often then, straying further from the shack, appearing at the edges of farms and roads. Their speech was garbled, sometimes little more than grunts and moans, their gestures wild, their clothes torn and stained from years of use. Some families told stories of waking in the night to see one of them standing silently at the edge of their fields, staring with crossed eyes that gleamed in the moonlight. The brave shouted and chased them away. The rest simply locked their doors and prayed. The shack itself decayed until it seemed on the verge of collapse. Roof beams caved inward, boards fell loose, windows gaped wider like empty sockets. But still, the children, now adults in name only, remained inside. To them, it was not a ruin. It was home, the only one they had ever known. And so the cycle stretched forward, unbroken, a living testament to the father's grip. Generations blurred into each other until no one in town could say for certain who was whose child, or whether any new blood had ever entered the line at all. Authorities occasionally came, urged by whispers of abuse, sickness, and incest, but their visits were brief, hesitant, and often ended at the edge of the property. The sight of the family, misshapen, half-feral, yet bound tightly to one another, was enough to send most back down the road in silence. No arrests, no interventions. The hills swallowed the truth again and again. And so the legend grew. Kentucky's forgotten shack became a place of fear and fascination. Its story passed like a warning from one generation of locals to the next. A story of a father who believed himself untouchable and of children who bore his curse long after he was gone. To step near that shack was to feel time fold in on itself, to feel as though the father's eyes still watched from the shadows, daring you to witness what should never have been seen.